You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 469 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich, and Tracy won't be with us this week. Her work obligations have been pretty brutal lately, so I thought she'd appreciate being relieved of podcast duties this weekend. We, however, dear listener, will soldier on, which means we'll continue with the story of the 1864 Red River Campaign. As you guys will recall, with last week's episode, we got Major General Nathaniel Banks' column of Federals to Alexandria, Louisiana on the Red River, where Banks linked up with Admiral David Dixon Porter and Brigadier General A.J. Smith. Between Porter's warships and the Army's transports, there were some 60 Federal vessels at Alexandria. A.J. Smith was in command of the Army troops on loan from William Tecumseh Sherman, and when combined with Banks' force, it meant there were about 30,000 soldiers and 90 artillery pieces concentrated at or in the vicinity of Alexandria, about 170 miles northwest of New Orleans, and they were there by the last week of March. At this time, Banks could only assume that Major General Frederick Steele's force, coming down from Arkansas, was also carrying out its part of the plan. So, as he later said in congressional testimony before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, everything seemed in place and success all but assured. After, quote, one bound to Alexandria, there would be, quote, one bound to Shreveport. Then he said, one bound to the Gulf, that is, into East Texas. And when put that way, it all seemed so simple. And it would be, if the Confederates didn't upset the apple cart. Spoiler alert, the Confederates will upset the apple cart and spoil Nathaniel Banks' carefully laid plans. But before the rebels had a chance to upset Banks' plans, it was actually the U.S. Navy that rained on Nathaniel Banks' parade, metaphorically speaking, when he got to Alexandria. When Banks, on the tin-clad Black Hawk, arrived at Alexandria on March 24th, accompanied by reporters and cotton speculators, he found, to his dismay, that the Navy was already carrying on a bustling business in gathering, processing, and transshipping cotton. Now, it was all legal, but Banks' cotton broker friends were upset, and Banks saw his grand scheme to be the savior of the New England textile mills literally floating away down the river. You see, Banks had arrived about a week behind schedule, and David Dixon Porter, whose ships had arrived at Alexandria on March 15th and 16th, had taken advantage of Banks' tardiness and the naval prize law to start gathering up hundreds of bales of the white gold. Now, the naval prize law allowed the Navy to seize, as war prizes, the properties of a belligerent nation and turn them over to an admiralty court, which would sell them and see that the proceeds were divided up among the officers and sailors who had done the seizing. Well, the Admiralty Court in question was located at Porter's home base of Cairo, Illinois. And in the configuration of the law at the time, the naval personnel presenting the prizes to the court received 50% of the total value of the captured property. And by the way, as commander, Porter's share was 5% of the 50%. Now, the other half of the total was paid into a fund administered by the Navy for disabled sailors. The law had been enacted in the early days of the Republic to make it advantageous for captains of warships to seize the enemy's merchantmen and receive extra compensation for themselves and their crews. The law was expanded to include war prizes of all types, as long as they had monetary value. And as we've said, cotton was an extraordinary valuable commodity in 1864. And since there was no equivalent mechanism for the Army to benefit from the spoils of war, there was considerable animosity between the two service arms. Army officers grumbled, even in official correspondence, that, quote, "every gunboat is loaded with cotton, and the officers are taking it without regard to the loyalty of the owners. It looks like a big steal," end quote. Well, several claims were adjudicated from civilians angry over losses due to the Navy's overzealous gathering of cotton. And so Porter had to defend himself before Congress, and he also did so in 2 post-war books. But Lieutenant Commander Thomas Selfridge, commander of the monitor USS Osage, admitted in his memoirs that the, quote, "incentive of prize money naturally influenced the Navy to be especially active in obtaining cotton," end quote. And so, there in Alexandria, day after day, while waiting for Banks' arrival, Porter sent his sailors out in ever-increasing distances from the town to obtain the white gold. Upstream and downstream from the town, the sailors fanned out 8 to 10 miles on both sides of the Red River. Bales of processed cotton were seized, as was cotton waiting for processing, which was ginned and baled by contrabands hired for the task or by sailors and Marines themselves. In his congressional testimony, Porter boasted that the sailors, quote, "made very good cotton bales." Well, the aforementioned Thomas Selfridge was one of Porter's favorite commanders, and the ingenuity he showed in gathering the white gold was typical of his style. You see, he devised a technique which Porter immediately had implemented by the others in his command, but Selfridge devised a technique for answering the question, well, how was one to know what cotton belonged to the Confederate government and what was private property? Now, this was an important distinction, since Confederate cotton was a legitimate prize of war, while civilian-owned cotton was not. And to get around this inconvenience, Selfridge had stencils made that read CSA. And using the stencil and a quick slap of regulation navy paint, well, it labeled the cotton for all to see as property of the Confederate government, and therefore legitimate booty. And as the marked cotton was checked in by the Navy quartermasters, it was also stenciled USN. In later congressional testimony, Colonel James Wilson stated that Porter, when asked what the letters CSA and USN meant, he joked that they, quote, stood for Cotton Stealing Association of the United States Navy. Empty coal barges towed by Porter's gunboats were loaded with cotton, as were the warships themselves. The only existing photograph of the naval squadron at Alexandria shows the monitor USS Neosho in the foreground with bales of cotton stacked on her deck, since they were too large to stow below. Altogether, the Navy officially reported gathering more than 3,000 bales of cotton in and around Alexandria, although the true number will never be known. Nor will the total number of bales burned by the Confederates after Major General Richard Taylor ordered his forces to do so to keep the cotton out of the hands of the Yankees. Certainly, it was thousands of bales. Wellington Withenbury, a steamboat pilot employed by the Federals, stated in testimony before Congress, quote, "I have no notion that a single person in that vicinity wished to burn their own cotton. There was a great effort made to induce General Dick Taylor to rescind the order to burn cotton. He said, 'Don't ask me. General Banks is coming with his army. Make your peace with him. If he respects your rights, I certainly shall.'" So, according to Withenbury, Taylor said he was only ordering the destruction of the cotton because of the wholesale seizure of it going on by Banks and Porter. Well, to offer the civilians an escape hatch, Banks, on April 2nd, wrote orders allowing locals to sell their cotton to prevent it from being burned by Taylor's Confederates. The civilians were allowed to bring in their cotton to the quartermaster's office at Alexandria for shipment to New Orleans, where it would be sold. However, Banks' effort was too little too late, and up and down the Red River and throughout the surrounding area, millions of dollars worth of the white gold were incinerated by Taylor's Confederates to keep it out of federal hands. We said in the last episode that Nathaniel Banks' cavalry reached Alexandria before his infantry and artillery, and when that column, commanded by Major General William Buell Franklin, finally did start to arrive, David Dixon Porter couldn't resist a dig at Banks. He wrote, quote, "It was as fine a body of troops as were ever seen in the Southwest. Notwithstanding a march of 21 miles, they came in quite fresh and full of spirits. But more than a week of valuable time had been lost since the 17th instant, the day on which General Banks promised to meet the Navy at Alexandria. And the conclusion arrived at was that the general did not possess the military virtue of punctuality, which the Navy had recognized in Generals Grant, Sherman, A.J. Smith, and other officers with whom they had hitherto cooperated." End quote. In fact, the last regiment didn't march into Alexandria until March 26th. On that date, Banks received a letter from Ulysses S. Grant, now a lieutenant general and general-in-chief of all the federal armies. Grant, never enthusiastic about the Red River expedition, but never in a position to stop it, now gave Banks his minimal expectations for it, outlining a timetable and demanding that Banks stick to it. Of course, Grant had no way of knowing that Banks was already behind schedule. And even had he known, Grant likely would have had little sympathy. In his letter, Grant told Banks, quote, "It is important that Shreveport should be taken as soon as possible." He then reminded Banks that even if, for any reason, there was a delay in taking Shreveport by the end of April, Banks must still return A.J. Smith's command to William Tecumseh Sherman by the middle of that month. And Grant stressed this point, saying Smith's troops must be returned to Sherman, quote, even if it leads to the abandonment of the main object of your expedition, end quote. Well, even if he could manage to capture Shreveport according to Grant's timetable, Banks was told not to advance beyond the town, but to garrison it with enough troops to hold the place and to keep the Red River open to navigation, and return with the balance of his force to New Orleans to prepare for operations against Mobile. So Banks' idea of a leisurely bound to Shreveport, such as he had undertaken to Alexandria, thus went up in smoke, like the pillars rising into the sky from burning cotton. He had to get a move on, but while Banks was now prepared to march on Shreveport immediately, he may have been ready, but the Red River was not. You see, Porter had been monitoring the river levels since the day he arrived in Alexandria, and he didn't like what he saw. William Tecumseh Sherman, who had lived across the river from Alexandria when he was superintendent of a school there before the war, had explained to Porter that the Red River rose every spring, and this was the only time Porter's squadron, particularly the deep draft gunboats, could proceed upriver to Shreveport. So Porter thus watched for the anticipated rise in the water level, but instead he saw the river falling, sometimes an inch per hour. However, with Banks anxious to get a move on and make the next bound to Shreveport, Porter realized he couldn't wait any longer, and he prepared to steam upriver. He secured the services of experienced local steamboat pilot Withenbury, who advised him to only take his light draft ironclads, monitors, tinclads, and the army transports above the falls at Alexandria. By the way, you scurvy dogs no doubt already know that light draft vessels were those that could operate in shallow waters. For example, back when we talked about the Federal's city-class ironclads, we pointed out they only drew 6 feet of water, so they could operate in very shallow water. In any case, then the falls at Alexandria weren't waterfalls, but it was a stretch there in the river where there was a tumble of sandstone boulders, which with high water in normal spring conditions could be navigated with care, since their positions were marked by swirls and eddies. However, when the river was particularly low, the boulders themselves were easily seen, which meant the water level was just a few feet above the channel floor. The twisting course through the boulders was called the chute, after the swiftly flowing water that formed rapids around the boulders. Porter listened to Withenbury's counsel and then did a curious thing. He told Withenbury to take USS Eastport over the falls. Withenbury protested, since Eastport was the largest and least maneuverable ironclad at Alexandria. He suggested taking other, smaller, lighter draft vessels up through the chute first, but Porter insisted Eastport lead the way. Two questions are relevant to the remainder of the naval portion of the expedition. First, why did Porter stubbornly insist on leading the way upriver with his largest, least maneuverable ironclad when the water level in the Red was dropping alarmingly? Second, why was the water level in the Red River dropping instead of rising as it normally did every spring? Well, as for the first question, David Dixon Porter was no dummy. He had already accumulated a great deal of experience commanding ships of the Union's Brown Water Navy on the nation's inland waterways, and he was monitoring the river levels several times a day. So he must have recognized Eastport was a liability in this situation. Well, the answer is probably found in the reports Porter had received that there were as many as 5 small Confederate ironclads at Shreveport. He may have wished to lead with Eastport because she was his ironclad killer and had an excellent chance of disabling or sinking a well-armored foe at longer ranges than his monitors or city-class ironclads. The huge ram on Eastport could also deal a knockout punch at close quarters if it came to that. At any rate, the prospect of facing a rebel flotilla of up to 5 ironclads may have blinded Porter to the obvious limitations of trying to get Eastport above the falls at Alexandria. As for the river level, the answer to that mystery was found in efforts the Confederates made upriver from Alexandria to divert much of the water away from the Red, and thus essentially drain the river like pulling the plug out of a bathtub. But Porter knew nothing of this, and so, having previously boasted that he could take his fleet, quote, wherever the sand was damp, end quote, and not wanting to lose face by admitting to Banks he couldn't support the army beyond Alexandria, well, Porter was determined to force the issue and run the falls with what ships he could.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Bowing to Porter's insistence that Eastport lead the way upriver past Alexandria, Withenbury piloted the huge ironclad toward the falls. The experienced steamboat pilot's fears proved well-founded as Eastport grounded in the chute, wedged among the boulders, and despite the efforts of tugs and lighter draft gunboats, there she stayed. Not until 3 days later, when the water level rose slightly, was Eastport able to be floated free and finally get upriver. Now, the slight rise in the water level occurred when a small portion of the water the Confederates had diverted into a bayou got back into the Red, causing a brief rise in the river at Alexandria. In any case, while Eastport was grounded, other vessels managed to get through outside the chute since Eastport's bulk fortuitously displaced enough water on either side to facilitate the passage of the later draft vessels. And in all, a dozen other gunboats and about 30 transports and support ships successfully passed above the falls. Withenbury asked Porter for permission to scout upriver to Grand Ecore aboard Blackhawk, Banks' headquarters ship, and the admiral agreed. In Withenbury's congressional testimony, he noted that when he steamed past Eastport on his way upriver, she was grounded again. Well, the little fleet required 4 days to negotiate the 100 river miles to Grand Ecore because the smaller, lighter draft vessels had to travel at the speed of the heavier, slower gunboats. And in addition, Porter's fears of an ambush by Confederate ironclads, which might be lurking around each bend of the twisting river, caused him to proceed cautiously. While waiting for Porter to get his vessels over the falls, Nathaniel Banks had ordered new elections for local officials at Alexandria, and he held those elections on April 1st. Now, Banks paid little attention to his military duties while he organized the elections, instead allowing Franklin to manage the day-to-day affairs of the force concentrated in and around Alexandria. Now, by the way, William Buell Franklin's name may be familiar since we've talked about him previously on the podcast, primarily in connection with his role in the Eastern Theater, trying to get Ambrose Burnside removed from command after the debacle at Fredericksburg. Anyway, as part of the fallout from trying to stab Burnside in the back, Franklin was banished from the Eastern Theater and exiled to Louisiana, where here he now finds himself second in command to Banks during the Red River Campaign. Anywho, after Nathaniel Banks was done playing politics in Alexandria with the elections on April 1st, he decided to ascend the river to Grand Ecore. Albert Lee's cavalry had left Alexandria and passed Henderson's Hill on March 26th, and A.J. Smith's infantry brought up the rear of the column and left on the evening of the 27th. Smith's contingent, however, marched only to a steamboat landing about 25 miles north of Alexandria, and there boarded transports to accompany Porter's little fleet. Just before Banks set out on April 2nd and headed for Grand Ecore, he wrote Henry Halleck one of many messages that caused concern in Washington. FYI, with Ulysses S. Grant elevated to General-in-Chief and determined to have his headquarters in the field, Halleck was left in place in Washington to function as the Army's Chief of Staff. So Banks wrote to Halleck, and Banks was so self-confident, so sure that the Confederates wouldn't confront him before he reached Shreveport, that he anticipated being there by April 10th. He told Halleck he would then, quote, pursue the enemy into the interior of Texas, end quote. Banks told Halleck he was well aware Grant expected him to send A.J. Smith's troop back to William Tecumseh Sherman by mid-April. So Banks was obviously skating on thin ice here, sending reassurances A.J. Smith's contingent would be returned to Sherman, while signaling his intention to ignore Grant's instructions not to advance beyond Shreveport. Well, this concerned Halleck, and Halleck showed Banks' message to Abraham Lincoln. The president shared Halleck's concerns, going so far as to predict, quote, the next news we shall hear from there will be of a defeat. During March and April in northern Louisiana, the moist air streaming up from the Gulf of Mexico meets the drier air of the continental United States, and frequent severe storms are common. Between rains, the heat quickly dries out the Red River Valley's sand and the red clay of the nearby hills. And so, when the Federals marched out of Alexandria, their letters and journals are filled with accounts that they did so on roads that alternated between dust bins and muddy soup. Lee's Union cavalry reached Natchitoches on March 30th and took the town simply by riding in. Franklin arrived on April 1st after marching 80 miles in 4 days. The Federals bivouacked between Natchitoches and the small village of Grand Ecore, 4 miles farther north on the Red River. Grand Ecore was the place on the west bank of the Red where the old colonial Spanish Royal Road, El Camino Real, began its long route to Mexico City. Located on the high bluffs at Grand Ecore, sitting above the river, were 2 old forts, where Ulysses S. Grant had been stationed early in the Mexican War. The Confederates had worked at fortifying the place, but abandoned it as the Federals came up the river. Porter anchored his ships, including the transports with A.J. Smith's troops, in a bend immediately downstream from the bluffs. Nathaniel Banks didn't arrive on the scene until late in the evening on April 3rd, having been delayed coming upriver by assisting Eastport, which had grounded yet again. But now that he was here, it was time for Banks to decide on the best route to take for his final bound to Shreveport. That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Red River Campaign, Politics and Cotton in the Civil War by Ludwell H. Johnson. You know, you just don't run across many Ludwells these days. Anyway, Ludwell H. Johnson's Red River Campaign, Politics and Cotton in the Civil War was first published back in 1958, so it certainly qualifies as a classic, but it is still the standard for books on the campaign. So there you go. It's got some legs. You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website, you can find information on becoming a member of the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Gina D., Larry O., Michael D., H. Frame, and Colonel Mudge have done recently. Just this past weekend, we released members episode number 155, which was a show on the Union's 100 Days Men. It's the story of thousands of men from 5 Midwestern states who served in the federal armies in the late spring, summer, and early fall of 1864 for, yes, you guessed it, 100 days. You can listen to that show and 154 other members' episodes if you head over to Patreon and sign on to be a part of the Strawfoot Brigade. And with that shameless plug, I think we'll bring the curtain down on this episode. Thanks for listening. Next time, we'll continue with the story of the Red River Campaign. But until then, take care. Thanks, everyone.